Welcome to Deleted Saves. On this episode, 10 Games to Know Me By. Hello, dear listeners. This is going to be a slightly different episode compared to the others in the 5-year history of the show. There was a meme going around a while ago that was a games to get to know me sort of thing. And while I'm sure some of you could guess which ones I would put on this list, I'd like to take this episode to give a rundown of my top 10 games to those listeners who may have joined well after I talked about these games, or just as a palate cleanse and a refresher for long-time listeners. Plus, some of my thoughts may have changed as time goes on. Now, is this a definitive list? Not necessarily. Depending on the day or time, I may change my mind, or these entries may move around. There may be new games that I would never have appeared on this list had I done this years ago because, well, they didn't exist yet. Or old games may have crept into my thoughts that I never previously considered. In any case, I get to talk about some favorites and you get to learn a bit about me. Or not. Who can say? In any case, let's get started. Number 10, ActRaiser. While not the original God game, ActRaiser allowed you to absolutely play God. Or God anyway. In the course of this combination action platformer and city building simulation title for the SNES. The story setup is brief. You are God, awoken after millennia of sleep by your angel, to return to your earthly creation to wipe out the scourge of your arch enemy Tanzara from all existence. But you must help your people along the way, bring them back to faith in you to allow you to help rebuild the world and crush the evil saturating it. If you know what you're doing, this is a game you can clear in an afternoon. There are 5 lands to conquer, each that start with a platforming section with a boss monster at the end, and in between, you help your followers grow their village while having your angel clear monster dens in their defense, while attending to their needs. A simple enough concept in hindsight. However, what this game held was a singular question. When do we find we need God? As you play the game, in the simulation sections, it is clear that your temple is full when times are bad. But as soon as times are good, the temples empty out as your followers pursue the mundane issues of everyday life in relative safety. After the game ends, as your angel is taking you on a world tour to see how things have played out in each region of the world, it is clear no one is coming to say thank you or worship you, despite you having slaughtered every demon and evil spirit in the literal world. It is at this point your angel asks the question of what would happen to higher powers if humans found that they no longer needed them, before leaving the world to return to another bout of prolonged slumber. Not exactly the simplicity of the statement God is dead, but it is a deeper sentiment that one might expect out of an action sim game where you just spent 8 hours of playing a seemingly benevolent warrior god fixing his own broken and ignored creation. And for the time I was playing it, it was a powerful statement to someone raised in a religious household where the concept of worship of a deity that controls every aspect of your life and afterlife was never to be questioned, and that someone was having a not uncommon level of doubt as to the validity of that line of thought. I'm not going to say ActRaiser made me an atheist, but it certainly set me on the path to the question that would lead me to having a far more secular worldview, and a desire to throw superstition out with the bathwater. I know the game has since received the remake treatment, and those who have played that game have been less than impressed with the remake, as it seems to be bloated with unnecessary content and suffering from an unusual difficulty spike early on. I have not played the remake, and I do not know if I ever will. But I would certainly always recommend the original title first, not only as an interesting combination of gameplay loops, but as a Japanese-styled god game that dared to be a bit snarky about the concept of reliance of something outside of ourselves to solve our problems, and about being willfully blind to our own self-actualization, acceptance of personal responsibility, and denial of rational thought when times are tough, as many people are wont to do when they encounter even slight resistance to their desires or supposed plans. Or maybe that has always been just my interpretation of it. Interpretation is, after all, subject to our lived experience and understanding of facts. And ActRaiser certainly has something that can be interpreted from it, if you are willing to look further into it. Number 9. Baldur's Gate. Perhaps one of the greatest CRPGs of all time, one that has had the greatest influence on the gaming landscape outside of something like Ultima, Wizardry, or Interplay's littermate Fallout. The first Baldur's Gate still sits for me atop a mountain of role-playing games, a king by its own hand. Based entirely on the pre-existing lore of the Forgotten Realms, once the domain of author and career librarian Ed Greenwood, until it was purchased by Gary Gygax and his fellows at TSR, Incorporated, until that publishing house was sold to Wizards of the Coast, now owned by Hasbro Games, this game allowed you to embody the Bhaalspawn, the scion of an evil god who has decided if you shall become a hero or villain as you gather your party of 6 members of adventurers to stop a man named Sarevok from fomenting war between the city-state of Baldur's Gate and its neighbors to cause enough death and destruction to be able to return Bhaal from divine exile. Exploration, taking on side jobs for cash and magical goods, and teasing out your companion's simplified backstories is the name of the game until you are powerful enough to and put together enough breadcrumbs to storm the stronghold of your enemy. The game plays using the now ancient 2nd edition rules set of Dungeons & Dragons, which were introduced in 1987. And for the record, the current tabletop role-playing game is on the 5.5 edition rule set introduced in 2024. For modern players coming into the game in 2026, these rules may seem as impenetrable as Fort Knox. However, when I first played this in 1998, there were only those rules available. So it was no problem to translate those tabletop rules of 2nd edition to a computer game. Well, perhaps easier for me as someone who was playing D&D at the time rather than someone who'd only played computer role-playing games. There was nothing like Baldur's Gate at its time. A broad, overarching plot where most of the threads paid off. NPCs that felt like mostly real, if silly people. A vast world where it felt like the secrets were endless, and at the time, about as close as seeing the tabletop rules in real life as we would get for literal decades. That is, until Larian Studios would translate 5th edition rules and update the lore into Baldur's Gate 3 and create a pure cinema blockbuster that I still have very mixed and diverse feelings about. But for this original title, my feelings are more clear. This is a fantastic game with no equal, especially for what was effectively a licensed game, something that should have been a death sentence. That speaks to the strength of the writing team and the art team that worked on the game. Current rumors at this time of recording state that its direct sequel, Baldur's Gate 2, is to be remade as it is said to be the stronger game. I disagree with this statement, especially because the first hour of that sequel makes no sense without you having played Baldur's Gate 1 first. But rumor says that this game will be remade as well, both on the strength of interest due to its 2023 and somewhat unrelated sequel, mostly due about 130 years having passed in the game world between Game 1 and Game 3, and the confusion that may cause. This is not a game that is easy to get into as it once was. Even its most recent update, Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition, was released in 2014 and is now 12 years old. A lot can happen in 12 years. But for those willing to give it a try, willing to do a bit of research, of how these old rules worked, a simple Google search or 10-minute YouTube video can clear up the confusion. For those players, this is a stone cold classic that awaits you, even if you never see the quest all the way to the end of its road. As a historic video game, a game who holds court if a realm all of its own, there is no comparison, and I make no apologies for loving this game, nostalgia or enhanced editions notwithstanding. It informs my own approach to games and storytelling. Not only one, of course, another CRPG of its ilk named Arcanum of Steamworks and Magic Obscura, another classic hidden in archaic computer rules, has also informed my approach to storytelling. But Baldur's Gate has been a critical influence on my creative life. And who knows? It may go on to influence more creative people in generations to come. Number 8. Dead Space, Dead Space 2, and Dead Space Remake. The famous tagline of the 1979 sci-fi horror thriller that states, quote, "In space, no one can hear you scream." Perhaps one of the greatest one-sentence to get butts in the seats of all time for a movie. However, when it comes to the Dead Space games, everyone can hear you scream. Or at least everyone else screams when it comes to Isaac Clarke, who is little more than a silent protagonist despite the madness going on around him until the second game. I picked this game up months after its release thanks to Ben Yahtzee Croshaw and his less than complimentary review of this game when he worked for The Escapist, which now seems like a lifetime ago when that was a thing. I know Yahtzee does a lot of parody in his game reviews as a famed internet author and curmudgeon, but to be honest, his hateful review is what drew me to this game. If he didn't like it, it had to be good. Maybe I just have bad taste. But I get the joke was that many games bad, not good like literature. Which sounds like someone who does nothing but try to flex on how smart they are by reading nothing but the so-called classics of Western literature, while ignoring non-Western nation books, and someone who has never spent time in the science fiction, fantasy, horror, romance, or any other not recommended by your ninth grade English teacher section of Barnes & Noble would act. And my God, was this game good. Dead Space, as we know, would not exist without Resident Evil 4. But that helped it find its own niche as a space meat grinder of screaming piles of barbed flesh, slasher movie level dumb decisions, and absolute cinema levels of spectacle, and the kind of space jargon that would make people like Elon Musk feel big in his big boy pants when he misquotes Gene Roddenberry. Isaac stomps, saws, and laser blasts his way through the undulating remains of the crew of the USG Ishimura, all the while collapsing under the weight of his own failing sanity due to the alien artifact aboard the ship, until he is the sole survivor and escapes, permanently damaged, into the cosmos. We pick up 3 years later in its direct sequel, Dead Space 2, when Isaac is in a straitjacket in the midst of a second outbreak of necromorphs, the name for the monsters, on the space station floating above the remains of the moon Titan, where Isaac tries to get to the bottom of this outbreak, survive, and deal with his broken brain that is actively killing him the entire time. It's pretty much the same gameplay loop as the first game, but somehow even better, despite everything EA did to absolutely kill this franchise with the rank stupidity and greed of the shareholders and the C-suite team. This is a fantastic pair of games. So when the remake of the game came out in 2023, 15 years after the original, this time with a fully voiced Isaac, who is a realized person instead of a blood-stained Iron Man suited errand boy, it truly elevated the game beyond what it had even had a right to be as far as excellence. It looked like we might get a Dead Space 2 remade as well, until it came out that the remake only sold 2 million units for EA. So they deemed it a financial failure and they canceled the remake sequel immediately. I've said this before elsewhere. But I would once again like to tell EA, not the workaday employees, but the middle managers, team leads, and executive staff, what a bunch of cowards you all are. You greedy, incompetent fecal stains on society. Yes, I know it's a business, but you drooling, empty-headed, craven yes-men decided that 2 million in sales of anything was substandard because you didn't get all the money instead of some of the money when you bilk the American populace annually for reskin soccer and football games to make these wireframe paper dolls look like whoever only graduated college because they could throw or kick a ball and that's popular that year. Do you even pay these guys royalties for the likenesses? Man, I guess we are that stupid as a society. I can't wait to hear how the buyout deal y'all are about to be doing that you're being sold to both Saudi Arabia and Jared Kushner treats you. Anyway, now that my rant's over, I suppose I should thank Yahtzee Croshaw. Had he not made such a publicly bad call in the name of cheap parody and clickbait views for video games journalism, I might never have found one of my all-time favorite games and its sequel. And remember, there was only ever one sequel to Dead Space. Number 7. Final Fantasy IV. The game that began my journey into the world of role-playing games. Final Fantasy IV was my introduction to the Square catalog and long-form game all in one. Prior to this, I was embroiled in platformers and arcade games, mostly beat-em-ups, like I think most players were in the early 1990s. These are just the kinds of games that would filter into the North American market, which, knowing what I do now, must have been brutal to work in, as Japan and Europe got many games we never would see because they were deemed unfit for the American market, mostly due to financial decisions, others due to censorship laws, due to our puritanical double standards, and ridiculous moral panics, and still others because they were so idiosyncratic they would never translate well. To be honest, were it not for the sudden attraction of role-playing games, I likely would have stopped playing games decades ago. I was never good at platformers, even if I liked them, but beat-em-ups were being replaced by fighting games, which I was bad at. In the local market, I could buy games from, due to being raised in a rural area, was very limited to whatever gaming blockbusters were out there, and the idea of importing was not happening in my household. But the adventures of Cecil and his crew of misfits and weirdos, looking to save their world from the terrors of the Moon People and whatever sword and sorcery maniac was willing to join up with them, while ensuing the sacred crystals were left pure and unsullied to keep their world turning, just delighted me in a way no other type of game has done or did so to that point. The world, for as tiny as it really was, felt truly endless and endlessly magical. The player characters that would appear and disappear on the breeze kept the story flowing and fresh. And even the few quirks of translation fiat gave us some memorable lines of dialogue for all you spoony bards out there. The stakes seemed to keep escalating and were near a fever pitch by the end, and I truly felt I was in a near apocalyptic battle for the heart and soul of the world these simple sprites inhabited. Sure, my concept of deep fantasy lore and storytelling has greatly expanded since that time, compared with what was on display in the narrative of this title, but my love for this game remains undimmed. In the decades since its release, it has been pixel remastered and reinterpreted with various levels of faithfulness or success, but few achieved what the Super Nintendo did, even if it was renamed to Final Fantasy II for North America due to the release schedule. But despite its age and simplicity, I still recommend this title to anyone looking into the Squaresoft back catalog if you have not played it previously or are new to JRPGs. I was new to them once too, and Final Fantasy IV is a great place to start. Number 6. Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain. Vampires have long been a staple of Western fiction, ever since the 1897 publishing date of Bram Stoker's Dracula. But even before that, with the 1872 serialized publishing of the story Carmilla, or the 1847 published Varney the Vampire, all of which codified vague and sometimes inaccurate or downright racist or ethnic slur-coded Polish, Slavic, Romanian, Eastern European folklore into a hodgepodge mess that we now know as vampire fiction that has been riffed on and modified since then to tell whatever horror story, morality play, sexual fantasy, or surrogate coming out story they're trying to expound upon. Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain, certainly started out that way when it debuted in 1996, more as an action role-playing game set not in the real world, but in a fantasy setting. Something akin to a twisted reflection of Middle-earth, where powerful wizards turn the landscape into whatever nightmare they like, and vampires hunt in the shadows. Now, I've never really been to vampire fiction, although I have come to enjoy horror fiction the older I've been getting. But as vampires and zombies are the two most popular types of monsters we see in modern day, we have to deal with it whether we like it or not. Kain, our protagonist, was a selfish nobleman killed for unknown reasons, turned into a vampire by a necromancer, who must unravel the mystery not only of why he was brought back to unlife, but also what happened to the Circle of Nine, why vampires are hunted near extinction to begin with, and why time itself seems to have gone all wibbly-wobbly. The game, in retrospect, of the modern times is rough. And really the best reason to experience this title is because of its excellent story and superior voice work. But Blood Omen exists well within the shadows of its sequels, particularly the two Soul Reaper games, which have been remastered within the past few years, and those games are less a horror story and more of a time travel adventure with dark gothic ambience. But they have put eyes back on these games after a very long time. The license has changed hand multiple times over the years. It is now held by people who are wondering how to try and milk these games for cash from fans and are already making huge missteps. And if any game desperately needs a ground-up remake, it is Blood Omen. Although I know in my heart it will never receive one. But despite all these things, Blood Omen remains one of the best vampire stories in the history of video games, and one of the best horror games available on the PlayStation 1 outside of the first 3 Resident Evil games and the first Silent Hill title. Thankfully, if you want to experience this title, it is available on GOG.com as of 2021, and I say do so. Maybe grab it on sale, but if you are only familiar with the recent remasters and want to know where this title and all of its tropes and chronological twists came from, then this is the game to play. Why I care about this game is because the way the story unfolds within the bonds of the game mechanics, or perhaps despite them, the delivery of its actors that was almost Shakespearean in quality. Blood Omen Legacy of Kain pushed what a quality game could be for a mass market entertainment consumption to the limits on the system where it was released, even if, as I said earlier, its sequels overshadowed it. But of all the games in the series, Blood Omen is the best one. The one that ends most definitively. The one that may not have even needed sequels to muddy its waters. And the one where the critical sacrifice was refused. Number 5. Fallout 3. While retrospectively cited as one of the most influential computer role-playing games of all time, the original Fallout was not exactly easy to find back when it first arrived on store shelves in 1997. Back when computer games arrived packaged in bulky boxes and were relegated to the back racks of stores like Babbage's and Electronics Boutique. And it was overshadowed by the release of its sister franchise, Baldur's Gate, almost a year later. Maybe you found a copy where you lived, but not where I lived, unfortunately. Anyway, I soon lost track of any sort of knowledge of the game until game journalists began to rumble about Interplay's collapse and sell off of IPs in the mid-2000s. and that Fallout may wind up in the hands of Bethesda Softworks, and how that was just about the worst scandal to occur to the United States since Watergate, or the Iran-Contra affair, or the Monica Lewinsky scandal, or September 11th. Did you get the hint yet? Which is funny, as most gamers at that time, meaning the 2007 complete IP sale, had never heard of Fallout, outside of an online vocal few who were worried about it maybe falling into the hands of the dirty console peasants and the quote-unquote untested studio that had sold millions with its third and fourth entries in its Elder Scrolls series. What happened was the release of Fallout 3. Me and, I assume, thousands of gamers' first-time experience in the ongoing world of post-nuclear role-playing. No longer an isometric game where you can talk your way out of trouble and fight it out in some of the worst real-time pause tactical combat interface ever implemented, and an AI that was nearly as brain dead as the mutants wandering the wasteland of a bombed-out fictional United States. Fallout 3 was now a first-person shooting gallery where players got up close and personal with the pitch-black humor and crushing despair of the ruins of the area around Washington, D.C., 200 years on from the last war the human race would ever fight on a global scale. You grew up in a vault, a twisted experiment by a corporation to be monitored by machines for generations after the world ended for unknown reasons, considering there's no one left to read the data. And you escaped after your father, the vault doctor. As he left, and all you want to do is find dear old dad and ask him why he left you behind in the hands of a murderous overseer. People lost their minds over this game, spending weeks exploring every nook and cranny of the game world, posting online theories and fan stories centered around this world, and being a better public relations push for the studio than any private firm could be. The game, pardon the pun, blew up. I was one of them, lost exploring this hellscape looking for answers and escapism. The success of this title silenced the old grognard critics, or at least quieted those grumbles, when their free market capitalist brains finally locked on to the returns this game was producing and allowed Bethesda to expand their empire fourfold, opening up new studios and associating with smaller studios to help produce their other ideas. All of which is now somewhat moot, as the whole thing was bought by Microsoft in 2021, and it has gone haphazardly since then, to say the least. But all that aside, Fallout 3 was the game for a long time. Assisted along by its sister game Fallout New Vegas a few years later. They could not be stopped. But fans began to question what the intent was when Fallout 4 arrived, which pretty much ditched the role-playing elements in favor of an FPS with complications, and those old grognards, the same ones from before, who were playing Fallout 1 in college and were now spending the majority of their time exercising their beer bellies on the nation's golf courses 17 years later, began chuckling at all the new fans brought in by Fallout 3 and repeating the phrase, "told you so," like a Buddhist mantra. What I'm saying is that watching what has happened to the game I was a die-hard fan of, that is now almost 20 years old and looks nothing like the game that started it almost 30 years ago, and how it has mutated and evolved since 2008 has been difficult to watch. The studio closures, the flight of talent, the hideous and I suppose unsurprising evolution. Fallout 3 was a time capsule, a game of the moment that can never be replaced or repeated. One that is now almost unplayable without heavy-duty modifications on PC or access to half-broken home consoles now almost 3 generations out of date. Maybe those rumors of a remake will prove true in the future, maybe not. They say there will be. I'm not going to trust them until I have it in my hands. Well, a license of it, I guess I should say. If you are young and never got to play this game, I'm sorry you missed it. If you're older than me and missed this game because it stood against everything you knew as a player of the original games, I'm sorry you missed it. As for the apocalypse, don't worry, folks. I don't think any of us will be missing that when it happens. Number 4, Streets of Rage 2. If any game would be said to be the apex of the beat 'em up game during the 1990s, it would be Streets of Rage 2. Not at its time the most well-known brawler on the market. I would say that would have been a licensed game like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4, Turtles in Time, or X-Men. But for the home console, it was the most technically proficient, reactive, and complex game of its genre. A year after the first game, where 3 ex-cops destroyed a citywide cartel, the roster expanded to 4 as a rescue mission is mounted to save one of the previous playable characters, in which the move sets were greatly elaborated upon. The city looks less dirty and gray and more colorful, and diverged into a wild jungle setting. The graphics were improved well beyond the capacity of the first game, and it was an all-around marvel for the Sega Genesis. The amount of bodily injury and chaos that could be caused was simply unmatched across most any beat 'em up. And considering the amount of games I played in the genre, I would know. And it was not until the current beat 'em up revival of the early 2020s would anything match what could be done in Streets of Rage 2. And the soundtrack is unparalleled in its genre to this day. A mix of techno beats, synth panic, smooth jazz rhythms, robotic blips and beeps, boiled in a cauldron of Latin heat and backing music that would not be out of place at a metal show. I don't speak much on soundtracks as I'm not a musician or a music expert, and it would feel disingenuous of me. But this is one I remember more than many other game soundtracks. And a rare one that fits its game like a glove fitted with brass knuckles. This is the game that is still freely available, and one that should be played by anyone who has even a passing interest in brawler-style games. If you have not played this, you absolutely need to. Number 3, Samurai Showdown. The beat 'em up was quickly surpassed by the 1 versus 1 competitive fighting game, most famously kickstarting by Street Fighter II. However, I was never that committed to Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, or Tekken. I was more of an SNK fan. And the game I actually got good at was Samurai Showdown. Different from its competitors for utilization of weapons-based combat and having more robust story than read like a Kurosawa film on acid, Samurai Showdown was a battle to the death of the late Edo period's fiercest fighters, as they tried to decide who would be the one to stop an undead sorcerer from unleashing a demon upon Earth. Now, nowhere near as technically competitive as the Street Fighter games, nor as gory as Mortal Kombat, although still cartoonish in its levels of violence. This series was overshadowed by its more famous competitors, and while receiving 5 sequels, each more proficient than the last, but each less well known than the original. But none of them will beat the first game's race to cut through the opposition on the way to stop the end of the world waiting for the final battle, rather than just being a tough guy simulator to see who can rip off a Shaw Brothers film, or become bloated by its own ridiculous lore and season passes. I'm not a fighting game guy, never have been. But if any game would have come close to getting me invested in a fighting game, being willing to get into fighting games or get good at fighting games, then Samurai Showdown was it. Number 2, The Elder Scrolls V: Skyrim. Many would argue that this game is not an RPG, at least not in the traditional sense. But I do not care. While you may not spend the game grinding experience and juggling stat blocks, The Elder Scrolls V: Skyrim certainly lets you adopt whatever role you want, not just stealth archer, and lets you explore a seemingly endless environment filled with caves, burial mounds, icy tundras, and scripted and unscripted encounters to give the impression of a living world, even if it was far from that. The main story of Skyrim is not what the draw of the game is. In fact, it's kind of lame. What the draw of Skyrim is entails all the side quests around it. The exploration, the semblance of verisimilitude of being able to live a life in this environment, building a home, chopping wood, forging weapons, and being a hero who decides the fate of wars, invaders, runs guilds, and the like. Never a king by your own hand, but being the king maker, arguably the more powerful position. And if you like modding games, there are now, in the year 2026, 15 years after its release, a seemingly endless amounts of mods for this game, running the gamut from goofy to sexy, immersive to immersion breaking, scary to super heroic. I'm a fan of the Inigo Quest follower mod myself, and the camping and frostbite immersion mods. Is this game the typical buggy Bethesda mess? Absolutely, but in a benign way as opposed to the more malignant way they do their games now. Has the game been re-released on everything but toasters since 2011? Yes, which is too much, but they need to keep the lights on in Maryland. Are there as many cons to this game as there are pros? Also, yes, and everyone's mileage varies, from abject haters to people who have made YouTube careers off of this game. But for as many times as I have replayed this game, I felt like this was truly a world, a rare thing in games no matter how well produced. I felt like Skyrim was a home away from home. And somehow, I am sure I never saw everything, or even half of it. I found the quests that I loved and wanted to replay again and again, even if I knew them by heart. I would wander, camp, putter around my home before spending in-game weeks away on high adventure. It was, in a word, magical. The kind of magic one can never reproduce. At time of this recording, we know its sequel, The Elder Scrolls 6, is somewhere in pre-production. It was announced officially in 2018 before deleted saves even existed as a show, and was likely done because fans were getting nervous and the heads of ZeniMax knew that of their impending sale to Microsoft and wanted to bump up their equity price. But still, it's been 6 years and nothing, not even a screenshot. And likely, it will not debut before 2030, no matter what Asha Sharma forces down Todd's throat. The goodwill Skyrim fostered has long since moved on, along with its audience. Now, I had some thoughts I'd written down, but I have to go a little bit off the cuff here, folks. At this point, we've waited far too long for the sequel. The magic is gone. It would almost be to benefit of Bethesda, its employees, its management, and I would say Microsoft, and I'm no fan of theirs, to outright cancel The Elder Scrolls 6, whatever state it's in, cancel everything else Bethesda's working on, and honestly close the damn studio. I know that's a wild take, but in the weeks since I wrote this, everything that has occurred, all the news that has come through, not something that I guess a casual person seeing this off the street would notice, but as someone who follows games, loves games, and was a fan of the studio for a long time, I hate to see this thing suffering. It's like an animal that needs to be put down long after all of its diagnoses have come true. But I know it's not going to. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the sequel will be fantastic. I doubt it. I may not even live long enough to see it at this point. Who knows? But, perhaps sometimes it's okay to leave on a high note and never return. This is, of course, considering their last game categorically bombed. I see you, Xbox Twitter fanboys. I didn't forget. And Fallout 76 has been the only thing keeping the lights on for almost a decade now. They will never be able to recapture this lightning in a bottle. Not that I think that's their plan, but they have gone from one of the tops of the world to just another AAA failure and a cautionary tale. The problem I still struggle with at the end of the day is that they created a game that truly made a world I saw as wonderful for all of its artificial nature. They made a true go anywhere, do anything title. And I know the concept is should it be a game, not a world, but then they just petered out. I know nothing I say here will convince people that this can be a great game, just as I know nothing I say will get people to think critically about the bad points of Skyrim either. And the further we get away in time, the more this game falls into myth rather than reality. It just is now what it is, I suppose. But Skyrim is also an object lesson. Either you die a hero, or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. But still, I do love the experience of this game. Number 1, Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 2 Remake. The game I view as the pinnacle of survival horror in the video game world is Resident Evil 2. It is one of those games I played nearly till the disc broke, one that I could have done speedruns on before that concept ever properly existed. The saga of the more human survivors, Leon and Claire, who were normal young people, not super soldiers like their STARS predecessors, trying to survive a night in the closest I think we ever came to a replication of George Romero's Dawn of the Dead, leading from a besieged police station to the underground base while escaping zombies and various overbuilt red and tooth and claw biological weapons, felt like the best of the genre. And to me, it remains the best game in a now 9 deep mainline series. Were there a lot of unusual and nonsensical design choices in the game to artificially increase the difficulty? Yes, and I'm not going to say there weren't. But I believe such hiccups are small compared to the greatness of the whole of this title. Leon and Claire felt like my friends. I was the same age as Leon was in canon when the game arrived on retail shelves, and I'll let you do the math. And then time moved on. The series moved on, returning to familiar and well-worn characters again and again rather than introducing fresh, new characters except in the very rare instance. The monsters moved on from zombies to more clever, thinking human-adjacent analogs, and the old games fell into the past, especially after the fourth game of the series changed the game market for literal decades and how horror, action, and adventure games would play. But time is a closed loop, it seems, as in 2019 Capcom would release a from-the-ground-up remake of Resident Evil 2 in the very same style as the original Resident Evil 4. They slimmed down the experience, cut out and reworked encounters from the original game that no longer made sense, and while it is not a one-for-one shot, it was more of a spiritual remake that made for a tighter, leaner, meaner experience. Leon and Claire were now young enough to be my kids, and I went from surviving along with them to rooting for them in their efforts. But I found this game did not replace the original. It lives alongside of it. Not a replacement, but a companion piece. And I found I had room in my heart for both of them, and both have come to be my favorite game of all time. Capcom has been on fire as a development studio ever since the release of this game, and in the years since they have remade the next 2 games in the series, released 3 more original titles, and have officially announced the remake of their weird offshoot titled Code Veronica. And this is alongside reiterations and revivals of a number of their other successful series. But for me, Resident Evil 2 remains the best they have ever made, both original and in remake form. It is this game that is the benchmark for me for the survival horror genre, by which I compare other games too. And not every game makes the grade. While psychology in horror has its place, it will never replace the visceral rush of putting the boot to some rampaging monster, some titanic thing out of time, some undead horror. And Resident Evil 2 is that game for me. Well, dear listeners, there you have it. If you want to know me and what I judge the games we play against, there you go. These are not all of my favorites, but these are, for better or for worse, my top 10. All of these are fantastic titles I hope everyone has, or had at least tried at some point, or are willing to try now. But now, it's time to go forward with a selection of titles that need to be discussed, and I haven't discussed these ones before. As always, thank you for listening. Deleted Saves would like to thank Brad, Keith Gasper, Masked Llama, Martin Kibel, and the many listeners and supporters for being patrons and fans of the show. If you would like to become a patron of the show, please go to patreon.com and check out Deleted Saves podcast. All donations go directly towards maintaining the show itself. Thank you.